A warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us on Business Incorporated. I'm Chimeze Obi Iwago. On the show today, Sudan signs deals for $300 million with Arab funds. South Africa's power cuts to continue as Eskom battles shortages. Plus, President of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina, speaks on the Africa Climate Change Fund. First, the markets. The Nigerian equities market seems to have started a new week on the negative side, trading 0.04% down at intraday. The market in Egypt started its trading week on Sunday and was down 0.67% at intraday today. Now, 3 Egyptian private companies are aiming to finalize the initial public offerings by the end of the year. 2 of the 3 companies have a combined market value of around 14 billion Egyptian pounds, and the third is yet to be valued. South Africa JSE index was up 1.10% despite electricity shortage in the country, and Kenya closed in the green on Friday. In the Middle East, most major markets were upbeat at intraday. Saudi Arabia's stock market inched up 0.13%. It's its first day as a member of the FTSE Russell's Emerging Market Index, which is expected to attract billions in passive fund inflows. In Dubai, the index was up 1.63%, with its largest listed developer, Emma Properties, gaining 1.1% and Emma Malls adding 1.7%. The Abu Dhabi index rose 1.80%, lifted by a 1.7% rise in First Abu Dhabi Bank. Qatar's index lagged 0.16%. And European stocks were slightly higher in the morning amid mounting speculation. The U.S. Federal Reserve could sound decisively dovish at its policy meeting later this week. Let's bring in my colleague in Frankfurt, Conrad, to give us an insight into the latest developments in the markets. Hello, Conrad. Good afternoon. Good to see you again.
Good afternoon, Timmy. Thanks for having me back on Channels TV.
Right. U.S. federal prosecutors are investigating developments of Boeing 737 MAX. How much of the Boeing troubles are hitting the commercial aviation industry operators since the crisis started on March 10?
Timmy, it depends on the parts of the world that we are talking about. Only about 15% of all of the Boeing 737 MAX airplanes that have been delivered so far. The total amount of around about 60 have been delivered to airlines here in Europe, with Norwegian being the largest buyer of those airplanes. It has about 18, a fleet of about 18 737 MAX airlines. And Norwegian is also the one European airline that said that it's going to sue Boeing for the damage it has had because of the grounding of those airplanes. The most important fleets of the 737 MAX are in the United States, with American Airlines and Southwest flying 22 and 32 machines respectively. In Africa, the problem is also likely to be relatively contained, with Ethiopian, of course, having the flight in those flights in operation with the 737 MAX. And also I understand that Nigerian Air Peace has to make its mind up because it has an outstanding order of 10 737 machines. Of course, at the moment, it wouldn't be a good idea for a company like Air Peace to simply cancel those orders. You know, if you've made a down payment on those planes, you probably have to write it off after a certain moment. And also, it's not like you could easily go to Airbus and order airplanes there instead. It takes a couple of years between the order and the delivery of an airplane. So it's probably the better idea for the others airlines to just wait until Boeing has sorted the problems with the software out. A solution is expected within the next 2 or 3 months at the latest.
Right, we'll continue to keep a tab on that story on Boeing. In the meantime, let's look at the M&A market in Europe. Of course, how are the markets riding the news of Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank formal merger announcement?
Well, the share price reaction is pretty optimistic. Deutsche Bank's shares up 5%, Commerzbank's shares up 7%. Of course, this might be, you know, the usual short-term reflex of short-term oriented investors who immediately buy shares as soon as there's talk about, you know, cost-cutting, job cuts, consolidation in a sector. Whether or not, you know, investors, shareholders, and also the financial community here in Germany will warm up to the idea of a merger of Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank in the midterm and long term remains to be seen. There's a lot of skepticism out there. Obviously, the idea behind it is that those two banks combined would find it easier to increase their market share. They would find it easier to increase their profit margins. But on the other hand, clearly, a bank would be created here too big to fail. Already now, Deutsche Bank is considered to be one of the systemically most risky banks of this world. So whenever a larger bank combined of Deutsche and Commerzbank in the future had a problem, it probably would have to be saved by the taxpayer again. And as you remember, our government's promised that never again the governments and taxpayers would have to bail out a bank. That's not the thing that would happen with such a merger, and that's why, you know, the idea has not many friends here.
Right. Another news on the wire is the German engineering group ThyssenKrupp AG having won a millions of euros deal from Egypt's El Nasser company to design and build a fertilizer company. Can you flesh up this story for us?
Yes, I can flesh it up a little bit at least. Egypt's El Nasser company for intermediate chemical wants ThyssenKrupp to design and build a fertilizer complex 100 kilometers or 62 miles southeast of Cairo. The volume of the deal is quite high. Thyssen talks about a mid-sized 3-digit million amount of euros. Sounds a bit obscure. Of course, it's always difficult with large projects like this to say how much they will cost in the end. Experts estimate at least a price of 250 million euros for this fertilizer plant. For ThyssenKrupp, what's most important is not so much what the amount of money in the end will be that it will make with this. What's important is that it's getting a large machinery, a plant engineering and construction job here, a piece of good news after all the negative news that's been coming out of the steel department of ThyssenKrupp in recent years. Of course, the other part, you know, the engineering and the plant building business has been a little bit in the shadows lately, and this brings this sector and this part of Thyssen's business back in the limelight, and that's why the reaction on the share market is very positive today. Thyssen's shares are up around about 3% today.
Right, Conrad. Well, Fed meetings kicks off tomorrow. Let's keep a tab on that. Thank you for your time. In Asia, major stock markets closed higher today as investors awaited developments on the U.S.-China trade front. The U.S. Federal Reserve was also set to begin its March policy meeting later in the week. Mainland Chinese shares advanced on the day as Shanghai Composite jumped 2.47% and Shenzhen Composite also added 2.706%. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index rose around 1%. The Nikkei 225 in Japan rose 0.62%. The Topix Index also added 0.69%. Over in South Korea, the Kospi closed 0.16%. And, of course, the ASX 200 in Australia gained 0.25%. And U.S. stock index futures were mixed, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average under renewed pressure by a drop in shares of Dow component Boeing. Boeing shares slipped in the pre-market after the U.S. Department of Transportation launched an investigation into whether there were lapses in the Federal Aviation Administration's approval of Boeing planes involved in 2 recent fatal crashes. Investors are also awaiting the start of a 2-day Federal Reserve policy meeting this week. The U.S. Central Bank will begin its meeting on interest rates on Tuesday, which ends with a news conference on Wednesday. There's also a strong focus on a potential trade deal between the United States and China. And away from the equities market and back here in Africa, South African power utility Eskom says it will continue with planned power cuts this week amid capacity shortages A cyclone in neighboring Mozambique has affected electricity imports into the country. Let's bring in a business analyst in Johannesburg, Tebo Kadima, to bring us up to speed with the state of things right now. Hello, Mr. Kadima. Thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Good afternoon to you and greetings to the viewers of Channels TV. I'm talking to you from the High Court of South Africa in Pretoria.
Oh, well, perhaps I may have to just start with that before I get to the situation of things there. Speaking from the High Court there, I know that a case regarding the proposed IPP is ongoing. Can you bring us up to speed with that? What's the situation? What's going on? What are the parties saying?
Well, the case before court today, which in fact wrapped up earlier than what had been anticipated, the case was set down for hearing for over 2 days, but it actually took half a day to argue. But the case relates to, or was brought by, Coal Transporters Forum, supported by the largest trade union in the country, which is the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, where they sought to set aside the agreements with independent power producers, and this was done last year. So the merits of that case have been argued, and the case really hinged on whether or not the Minister of Energy of South Africa, together with the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, had complied with the stipulated provisions in law in signing those independent power producer agreements. And judgment has been reserved, but it's a very important case for the country, because in whichever way that it is concluded, it will determine whether or not South Africa continues to enter into more independent power producer agreements with IPPs, or if this might mark the end of the private investors into the energy sector.
Well, considering the current situation, can you bring us up to speed with what the situation is right now, particularly with the cyclone in Mozambique, which has affected power cuts, or rather power electricity imports into South Africa?
Well, at the moment, when we look at it, the power system remains constrained. However, it is puzzling as to why the power system should remain constrained in the manner that it is. The cyclone that happened in Mozambique should not have affected the power supplies in South Africa, even though South Africa currently gets over 1,000 megawatts of electricity from the hydroelectricity power plant, which is Cahora Bassa. However, we must bear in mind that during the years of apartheid, even post-democracy, the unwritten policy for South Africa has always been not to buy more than 1,000 megawatts from a neighboring country. So, because of the perceived inherent risks which pertained to acquiring more than 1,000 megawatts of electricity from a neighboring country. But that policy effectively should have extended to procuring over 1,000 megawatts of electricity from the independent power producers. And certainly what we are seeing now is a case of the chickens coming home to roost for failure to adhere to that policy, which for a long time safeguarded or made sure that South Africa was energy secure. Because Eskom has got, within its own fleet of power stations, has got installed capacity in excess of 44,000 megawatts. But the current demand in the country is only around 32,000 megawatts maximum. So ordinarily, Eskom should not have been in a position of load shedding. But as a result of the policy that has since been pursued of signing up independent power producers, we saw Eskom effectively prematurely closing down some of their base load power stations based on coal, but also, on the other hand, not maintaining a maintenance regime which should have ensured that they have lesser plant breakages. We have seen that most of the power plants of Eskom currently are having breakdowns, and those breakdowns largely are due to the boiler tubes that are breaking. So all of these things could have been avoided, but have not been avoided, to the extent that now we see a country that has got nameplate capacity or in excess of 47,000 megawatts, including the IPPs, but not able to meet the energy demands.
Right. Anyway, thank you very much, Mr. Kane. Let's hope that Eskom gets to resolve.